On March 19, 1935, in Harlem, New York, a 16-year-old mixed black and Puerto Rican boy named Lino Rivera was beaten when he stole a 10-cent penknife from the Crest 5 and 10 store. A penknife is a small pocket knife with a blade that folds into the handle. The store owners caught the boy before he had a chance to leave the store. Rivera resisted and bit them both, so they waited for the police. When the police arrived, the store owner was afraid what might happen if the boy walked out of the front of the store in handcuffs and asked the police to let Rivera go. The officer led Rivera down into the store's basement and out the back door. However, the crowd out front believed that Rivera had been beaten, and then later rumors spread that Rivera had been killed. A crowd then began to form outside the store, and the increasingly angry crowd demanded to learn what had happened to the boy. The more the police insisted that was none of their business, and then tried to shove the milling bystanders outside. At 5:30, the store closed and a crowd spilled out onto the streets. A group of men tried to hold a public meeting to protest the alleged beating, but 2 speakers were charged with unlawful assembly. The mob spread to 7th Avenue and Lenox Avenue, smashing store windows and looting shops. Then, more than 500 white police officers were summoned to put down the disturbance, but instead they were pelted with rocks and bottles and 8 were injured. By the end of the night, the police had detained 121 people and 57 civilians, and 7 police had been injured. And most tragically, Lloyd Hobbs, a black schoolboy on his way home from the cinema, had been shot and killed by the police. The death of 3 African Americans and hundreds more injured stopped the people from rioting throughout the night, and the next day it pretty much diminished. On July 12, 1967, in Newark, New Jersey, cab number 45 double-timed it towards the intersection of 7th and 15th Street. Piloting it was John Smith, a black 40-year-old Army veteran and trumpet player. As he approached the intersection, he noticed a New York police cruiser with 2 white officers inside seemingly double parked. Smith, who had a checkered driving record to say the least, flipped his lights and passed. The police cruiser followed and pulled him over, claiming they were moving and he was tailgating. Smith was arrested by force, allegedly resisting arrest, and was taken into custody. Upon their arrival at 4th Crescent, Smith's beaten body was dragged into the station. According to the police, he refused to walk on his own. According to Smith, he couldn't walk, as hundreds of eyes glared out the windows of the 12-story Hayes Public Tower, housing towers across the street. As news of the arrest spread, a crowd began to assemble in front of the Crescent House. When the police allowed a small group of civil rights leaders to visit the prisoner, they demanded that Mr. Smith be taken to a hospital. However, the police would not let it. Then, rumors spread that John Smith had died in police custody, despite the fact that he had been taken out the back entrance and transported to a local hospital. Soon, a volley of bricks and bottles were launched at the Crescent House, and police stormed out to confront the assembly. As the crowd dispersed, they began to break into stores on the nearby commercial thoroughfares. Within 48 hours, National Guard troops entered the city. With the arrival of these troops, the level of violence intensified. On March 3, 1991, Rodney King was severely beaten by the police. The police attempted to pull him over in Lakeview Terrace in the San Fernando Valley after he was caught speeding at 110 miles per hour. He led the police on a short pursuit because he knew being pulled over would violate his parole for a prior robbery. The police claimed that he was resisting arrest once he was pulled over. They claimed that they believed he was on drugs, although he was not. The police proceeded to beat Rodney King severely for about 15 minutes, resulting in skull fractures, broken bones and teeth, and permanent brain damage. The police did not know what they were being filmed for most of the beating. The people that filmed it brought it to the media, and the film was repeatedly shown on TV. The 4 main officers involved were brought to trial in Semi Valley on charges of using excessive force. The 4 white officers represented for many people of color everything that was wrong with the police. On April 29, 1992, the 12-person jury, which included 10 whites and no African Americans, issued its verdict, not guilty on all counts, except for one assault charge against Powell that ended in a hung jury. The acquittal sparked rioting and looting in Los Angeles. Hours after the verdict were announced, outrage and protest
turned into violence as rioters in South Central Los Angeles blocked freeway traffic and beat motorists, wrecked and looting numerous downtown stores and buildings, and set more than 100 fires. On the first day of the riots, the most famous event took place. Reginald Denny, a white truck driver, was crossing Florence and Normandy. He was pulled out of his car by Domaine Williams, a resident of the area. He was severely beaten while a helicopter recorded the incident. Williams took a piece of concrete and slammed it against Denny's head and then celebrated. Denny barely survived. Then on day 4 and 5, the National Guard enters South Central and begins to restore order. There are random areas of violence for days on end, but otherwise the riots have diminished.
On August 9, 2014, in Ferguson, Missouri, an African-American, Michael Brown, was shot dead by a white police officer, Darren Wilson. Events that happened during the shooting are still unclear today, but controversy rose when the world heard that 18-year-old Brown was an unarmed boy shot by a white police officer. Demonstrations in the city and throughout the country were further fueled by a grand jury's failure to indict Officer Darren Wilson and a damning Justice Department report that exposed deep-rooted discrimination in the practices of the Ferguson police and courts. Some say Brown was trying to surrender, while Wilson and others allege that Brown had attacked Wilson and tried to grab his gun. Earlier in the day, a surveillance camera captured Brown and his friend, Dorian Johnson, allegedly stealing cigars from a convenience store. Wilson would cite the robbery in his grand jury testimony. In a press conference, St. Louis County Police Chief John Belmar says Brown was shot after he physically assaulted a police officer. Belmar declines to name Wilson at this time, citing concerns for the officer's safety, but confirms that Brown was unarmed. Brown's parents hire Benjamin Crump, a lawyer who represented Trayvon Martin's family. The first night of unrest follows as protesters clashed with white police Ferguson, and more than 30 are arrested. According to police, 2 officers were injured, and more than a dozen businesses are damaged or looted. The next day, the Brown family held a press conference demanding justice for Michael. The FBI announced it was joining the investigation, but unrest continued in the night while police using tear gas and rubber bullets against the protesters, some of whom were alleged to be firing guns at officers. The fourth night of protest results sees Molotov cocktails thrown by protesters while heavily armed police deploy armored vehicles. Then President Obama addressed the nation on the situation in Ferguson, saying there was no excuse for protesters to turn to violence or for excessive force by police. Governor Jay Nixon announced that the Missouri Highway Patrol would take control of the law enforcement operation on the ground, hoping that it would ease tensions between the protesters and Ferguson police. On the 7th night, Governor Nixon declares a state of emergency in Ferguson and imposes a curfew, making it illegal to be on the streets after midnight. On the 9th day, the protests were showing no signs of ending, so Nixon deployed the National Guard into Ferguson. Finally, on the 11th day, after Eric Holder, Obama's black attorney general, flies to Ferguson to meet with Brown's family and local officials, a grand jury convenes to begin determining whether Darren Wilson, the white police officer, should be criminally charged in the death of Brown. That night, the streets are quiet for the first time in 10 days. The next day, the National Guard leaves Ferguson, and a few days later, on August 25, 2014, hundreds of emotional people gather at the Friendly Temple Missionary Baptist Church for the funeral service of 18-year-old Michael Brown.
The Harlem Riot, Newark Riot, LA Riot, and Ferguson Riot might have been during different decades. The underlying causes are all similar. Their underlying causes display in each decade the discrimination, white prejudice in employment, mistrust in police, hunger, overcrowded tenements, filthy sanitation, corruption of the court, discrimination in relief, and the main one being police brutality against those of color. These problems led local African American residents in each riot to feel powerless and disenfranchised, hence leading to the disastrous and deadly riots that struck Harlem, New York, Newark, New Jersey, Los Angeles, California, and Ferguson, Missouri.